So Judge Booseberg, Washington, D.C. federal court, he made a very important order recently saying Kristi Noem and Trump regime officials who are involved submit declarations about what happened, and I'll assess if we need to have live testimony or if the behavior by you is contemptuous. If there is a finding of contempt, we may not need a live hearing. You may not need to show up as a witness, Kristi Noem and others who were involved, but just submit a declaration, because the judge previously got the DOJ to admit that it was Kristi Noem who made the decision to violate the court order effectively. But the judge said, I want to hear more.
When this story begins, there is no fanfare, no urgent speech, no solemn announcement, only a heavy silence in Washington. The kind of silence that emerges when something very serious has happened and those in power hope no one asks questions. Meanwhile, away from the cameras, a federal judge examines documents, cross-references dates, checks decisions, observes who signed what, and notices something that changes everything. A court order had been knowingly and deliberately ignored. This judge is James Booseberg, and he represents everything Donald Trump despises the most: limits, rules, independent institutions. Booseberg is not an activist, not a politician, not seeking fame. He is a respected professional, and precisely because of that, he is dangerous to any government attempting to push illegal actions as if they were mere administrative decisions. What appears in the records is serious. More than 130 men were removed from the United States without proper trial, without due process, without a real chance to defend themselves, placed on planes, and sent to a maximum security prison in El Salvador, a location internationally known for reports of abuse, extreme violence, and practices experts describe as torture, all despite a clear court order explicitly forbidding exactly that procedure. It's essential to understand what this means in practice. We are not talking about an abstract debate on immigration. We are talking about real people, ripped from a country where they were under legal protection, transformed into numbers, statistics, disposable pieces of a political narrative created to please an electoral base. The public justification was simple. We are deporting dangerous criminals. A short, effective, emotionally powerful phrase because it eliminates empathy and kills questions. But the law does not work that way. In law, it is not enough to accuse, you must prove. It is not enough to label, you must guarantee defense. Above all, court orders must be obeyed, even when they interfere with the political agenda of the sitting government. And that is exactly what did not happen. The order was clear. Do not disembark these people. Do not proceed with the transfer. Do not ignore the court. This was not a suggestion or recommendation. It was a judicial order. Yet the planes landed, and this detail changes everything because it shows intent, awareness, and that someone decided to go ahead knowing they were disobeying the law. From that point on, the case ceases to be administrative and enters the criminal territory. Contempt is not just a word. It means the government treated the judiciary as a disposable obstacle. It means the separation of powers was ignored as if it were an irrelevant detail. At the center of this decision is Kristi Noem, the same official who days earlier avoided answering questions in Congress, the same one who left a hearing to avoid explaining her conduct. Now, in front of a federal judge, she tries the oldest strategy in the political manual: invoke secrecy, attorney-client privilege, professional privilege, executive privilege, anything to block uncomfortable questions. But Booseberg does not accept it. He recalls a basic principle of law, the exception of criminal fraud. When a legal privilege is used to conceal a possible crime, it ceases to apply. Simple as that. And this statement completely changes the course of the story, because now this is no longer about political disagreement. It is a real investigation for criminal contempt, with personal consequences for Trump administration officials. The Department of Justice reacts by attacking the judge, calling the decision judicial activism, accusing the court of interfering with the separation of powers. In plain language, The government is saying the judge should not ask questions, and that alone should alarm anyone who still believes in democracy. When a government begins treating court orders as personal affronts, the rule of law begins to crumble. At this moment, a name emerges that changes the game completely: Ruveni. He is not a politician, not a public figure. He was the lawyer in the room, heard the conversations, participated in meetings, saw how decisions were made. When the court asked, he did what any public servant should do: he told the truth. And for that, he was fired. Not for technical error, not for incompetence, but for not being loyal to Donald Trump. This dismissal turns Ruveni into something extremely dangerous for Trumpism: a whistleblower with direct evidence, someone who knows the backstage, someone who can point out who decided, when they decided, and why they decided to ignore a court order. From that point on, the silence of authorities ceases to be protection and becomes a risk, because in law, silence also speaks, especially when there is someone willing to tell the full story. And here, my opinion must be clear. This is not conservatism, not patriotism, not defense of law and order. This is authoritarianism. It is the logic that the leader is above the law, that judges exist only to obey, and that institutions are tools, not checks and balances. Booseberg represents limits, and limits have always been intolerable for Donald Trump. And this story does not end here. It has only just begun. As the case progresses, Booseberg realizes he is not dealing with just an administrative decision. He is dealing with a recurring pattern of behavior within the Trump administration, a mix of institutional arrogance, disrespect for the judiciary, and attempts to use legal privileges as shields against accountability. Meanwhile, in the Department of Justice, people scramble to find any argument to justify the illegality, any excuse to turn disobedience into legitimate action, trying to paint the judge as a judicial activist. But the truth is, Booseberg takes no sides. He applies the law. And that simplicity irritates the establishment, because clear decisions limit personal power. And Trump cannot tolerate that. Ruveni remains a central piece of the puzzle. He remembers every meeting, every order, every attempt to manipulate the situation. And precisely for that reason, his presence becomes explosive for any narrative defending the administration. He is not just a witness. He is living proof that there was a conscious decision to ignore court orders. Every detail he recounts strengthens the perception that Trumpism operationalizes authoritarianism within institutions that should be independent and neutral. The Department of Justice responds with legal maneuvers, trying to block testimony, invoking executive and attorney-client privileges. But the judge maintains his position firmly. The criminal fraud exception does not allow legal privileges to be used to cover up crimes. This turns each refusal into possible negative inference and each legal maneuver into evidence against those responsible. Meanwhile, the government's public narrative tries to downplay the severity of the events, attempting to reduce real people to numbers and statistics, a calculated move to numb public opinion. But the judiciary works differently. It examines evidence, testimony, documents, and the behavior of officials, and is not impressed by political rhetoric or media attacks. That is why Booseberg's case becomes an example of institutional integrity within an environment where personal loyalty often outweighs the law. The planes that transported the men to El Salvador become symbols of an administration that places politics above law, and every decision that led them there is rigorously questioned. The illegality is not in the details. It is systemic. It demonstrates a pattern that places the government above rules everyone else must follow. And this perception is critical because it establishes precedents for how executive power and Department of Justice authorities can act when there is no independent oversight and judges willing to intervene. Here, I want to make my opinion crystal clear, directly and without beating around the bush. This is not a debate about immigration nor partisan politics. It is about fundamental principles of democracy and the rule of law. Trump demonstrates in this case that he believes he is above the rules, that judges exist only to obey, and that institutions are tools, not checks. Booseberg does exactly the opposite. He shows that rules exist, that limits matter, that the conscious violation of court orders has consequences. And that is a shock to any government accustomed to manipulating institutions for personal gain. The pace of the process begins to intensify. Witnesses are called, documents are analyzed, and every refusal by an official to testify becomes additional evidence against the administration. Booseberg maintains a calm but firm stance. His narrative is clear and coherent, every decision carefully recorded, every observation of the court reflecting years of experience and a deep understanding of what it means to be a federal judge in the United States. And it is precisely this stance that makes the case historic, a milestone in the confrontation between a government that ignores rules and a judiciary that insists on enforcing them. While the public follows fragmented news and politicized narratives, the reality in court is different. Justice unfolds step by step, without haste, without spectacle, but with surgical precision. Every move by Booseberg and every action by Ruveni creates a detailed record of illegality and institutional disrespect that cannot be erased and will serve as the basis for future accountability, if not immediately. As the trial continues, it becomes evident that we are not dealing with isolated mistakes or minor incidents. We are facing a pattern of decisions that completely ignore due process and treat the judiciary as a temporary obstacle. Every move by Trump and his allies in the Department of Justice seems calculated to circumvent accountability and protect personal and partisan interests. And the more the case unfolds, the clearer it becomes that the gravity of the actions lies not only in formal illegality, but in the message it sends to the country. A message that laws can be bypassed, institutions can be manipulated, and people can be treated as disposable objects. Ruveni remains a central figure. He not only knows the facts, but understands the mindset that produced them. He saw how orders were issued and deliberately ignored. He knows who made the decisions and who consented to them, and each of his testimonies strengthens the narrative of institutional disrespect and abuse of power. Yet the Department of Justice continues trying to create smokescreens, using executive privilege, legal protections, and procedural maneuvers to prevent the truth from coming out. But Booseberg does not back down. He understands that the law is not flexible when it comes to preventing crimes and uses every tool at his disposal to ensure that violations are investigated and documented. Meanwhile, Trump's public narrative tries to downplay the situation, reduce the case to a common political clash, and turn real citizens into statistical numbers. This attempt at moral anesthesia does not change the reality. Every man sent to El Salvador without trial represents a blatant disregard for basic justice and human rights. Every decision made to ignore court orders leaves permanent marks that cannot be erased with political rhetoric or media attacks. In court, every witness's refusal to testify is carefully recorded and considered by the judge as potential evidence of contempt and bad faith. The process becomes a detailed record of the conduct of officials who chose personal loyalty to Trump over the law and due process. From there, every legal action becomes concrete proof of intent and awareness in violating legal and constitutional rules. The Department of Justice's action in attacking the judge, calling it judicial activism, is a desperate attempt to delegitimize the process. Yet it fails when confronted with the clear reality that Booseberg applies the law rigorously and impartially. This difference in stance highlights the contrast between a government that ignores limits and a judiciary that insists on enforcing them. A crucial point for the public to understand, as it demonstrates the importance of institutional independence and the court's role in preserving the rule of law even under extreme pressure. My opinion is that what we are seeing goes far beyond simple political or partisan disputes. It is a clear warning about the risks of authoritarianism and the political use of institutions. The attempt to silence witnesses, manipulate legal privileges, and ignore judicial decisions sets a worrying pattern. Booseberg's stance is exemplary because it shows that the law exists, limits matter, and the power of a president is not absolute and cannot override fundamental rules of justice and accountability. While the court maintains its calm and firmness, the country follows fragments of information and often distorted narratives. The reality is that justice is being carried out step by step. Every testimony, every document, every decision, faithfully recording what happened and creating a historic precedent for future accountability and to protect institutions from abuse of power. This is exactly why this case is so relevant and why it deserves careful attention from all who care about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. As the trial progresses, it becomes clear that the impact of this case goes far beyond Christine Nome or Ruveni. We are witnessing a demonstration of how a government can attempt to rewrite rules, manipulate institutions, and use executive power to protect its own interests. Every act of deliberate disobedience to the law leaves deep marks on institutional credibility and sends a dangerous message that authorities can act above the law with no immediate consequences. Yet the judiciary, represented by Judge Booseberg, resists and shows that limits exist even under immense political pressure. Every step in court demonstrates that judicial independence is not optional. It is essential to preserving democracy and protecting citizens from abuse of power. Ruveni's role is decisive because he is not just a witness. He is the bridge between what happened behind the scenes and what the court needs to know. He saw the meetings, heard the decisions, knows who authorized the illegal transfer of people, and every detail of his testimony builds a clear picture of disrespect for court orders and the conscious violation of due process. While the Department of Justice attempts to minimize the situation by claiming secrecy and privilege, the judge reminds that when a crime is suspected, these privileges cannot serve as a shield for illegality. This position makes the case an emblematic example of how the law must be applied even against powerful interests. At the same time, the public narrative is manipulated to downplay the severity of the case and turn real men into national security statistics. But this is not about numbers. It is about human lives taken from a country where they were under legal protection, without trial, without defense, and sent to a place with a history of torture and systemic abuse. Every action taken in this context reveals a pattern of institutionalized authoritarianism, and the attempt to use legal privileges to justify these actions only reinforces the perception that there was conscious intent to violate the law. The court carefully observes every witness refusal, every procedural maneuver, every attempt to manipulate privileges as evidence of contempt and bad faith. This detailed documentation creates a permanent record of illegal conduct that cannot be erased and can serve as a basis for future accountability. This is exactly what makes the case historic. It shows that even under extreme political pressures, a firm judiciary can protect the rule of law and impose limits on a government attempting to act above the law. My opinion is clear. What we are witnessing is a historic warning about the dangers of authoritarianism and the manipulation of institutions by the executive branch. When laws are ignored, when court orders are disrespected, and when legal privileges are used to cover up crimes, democracy weakens and the risk of abuse of power increases. Booseberg and Ruveni, by fulfilling their roles ethically and courageously, demonstrate that it is possible to resist political pressures and protect rights and institutions. This stance should serve as an example for everyone who values the rule of law in protecting citizens and institutions. While the public follows fragmented and distorted news, the reality in court is clear and objective. Every testimony, every decision, every document records what really happened and ensures that violations of court orders are not ignored. It is this contrast between the manipulation of the public narrative and the seriousness of the judiciary that makes the case emblematic and essential for understanding the limits of power and the importance of institutional independence. The story is not limited to an isolated episode. It is part of a worrying pattern of authoritarian behavior that threatens fundamental principles and human rights. The court's actions in this context represent historic resistance to the manipulation of the legal system by the government and a guarantee that even against powerful interests, justice can prevail and create precedents, reinforcing the importance of the rule of law and individual accountability within any administration. As we reach the conclusion of this case, the historical significance of what is happening becomes increasingly clear. This is not just about Christine Noem, Ruveni, or even the Department of Justice. It is a real test for American democracy and institutional independence. Judge Booseberg, with his firm and meticulous stance, demonstrates that limits exist and the law is not flexible to accommodate personal interests or political agendas. When a government chooses to violate court orders consciously and deliberately, it creates dangerous precedents and weakens the foundations of justice. But Booseberg resists and shows that it is possible to enforce the law even under extreme pressure. Every testimony, every document analyzed, and every refusal to testify recorded by the court builds a detailed record that cannot be ignored or erased. This documentation strengthens the possibility of future accountability. Every act of contempt recorded, every attempt to manipulate legal privileges to hide illegalities becomes concrete proof of conscious intent to violate due process and human rights. Ruveni's role is crucial because he not only knows the facts, but also the mindset behind the decisions. He saw meetings, heard internal discussions, knows who authorized what, and can report everything accurately. Every detail of his testimony transforms the case into a clear example of abuse of power and demonstrates the importance of courageous whistleblowers who choose truth over blind loyalty to a political leader. Meanwhile, the public narrative continues attempting to downplay the severity of the case as a common political dispute and to turn real people into numbers or national security statistics. But the reality is very different. We are talking about men taken from a country where they had legal protection, without trial, without defense, and sent to a place with a history of torture and systemic abuse. Every action taken in this context reveals a pattern of institutionalized authoritarianism that ignores human rights and disrespects justice. My final opinion is direct and straightforward. What we are witnessing is a historic warning about the dangers of authoritarianism. When the executive branch believes it is above the law, when court orders are disrespected, and when legal privileges are used to cover up crimes, democracy is threatened. Booseberg and Ruveni demonstrate that it is possible to resist political pressures and protect the principles of the rule of law. Ethics, accountability, and institutional independence are essential for justice to prevail and to prevent abuse of power. This case is not just an isolated episode. It is emblematic and sets important precedents for how institutions should react when confronted with illegality and abuse of power. It shows that even against powerful political interests, justice can prevail, the law exists, and those responsible must be held accountable. The public narrative may attempt to distort facts, minimize events, and turn victims into statistics, but the court maintains its detailed record. Every testimony, every document, every witness refusal forms a solid foundation for accountability and institutional preservation. The impact of this case will be felt for years. It shows that judicial independence is indispensable, that limits exist even for the most powerful, and that authoritarianism cannot thrive without resistance. It reminds us that democracy depends on strong institutions, courageous judges, and attentive, conscious citizens, and that when everyone fulfills their role, even powerful leaders can be challenged and held accountable. This is exactly what makes this process not only a legal story, but a historic milestone and a permanent warning about the risks of concentration of power and disregard for the law. As public attention continues to follow the unfolding hearings, it is essential to understand that this story is bigger than any political figure. It is about the rule of law, human rights, institutional accountability, and the ability to resist abuse of power. The lesson is clear. Justice exists and must be respected, even when political pressures attempt to subvert it. Every decision made, every testimony recorded, and every order obeyed or disobeyed will leave deep marks on the future of the country and serve as a historical reference for all who believe in democracy and the importance of independent and accountable institutions.